The eminent missiologist Ralph Winter, who sadly died last year, wrote a paper which became very influential. It had the extremely snappy title of Four Men, Three Eras, Two Transitions, Modern Mission. And he suggested that the history of modern mission could be summed up through three eras which were typified by pioneers of each era. The first was the missions to the coastal lands through people like William Carey, and then the inland missions, which were typified by Hudson Taylor. And then finally, the third era of modern mission was born in the 1930s and was typified by two men, Cameron Townsend and Donald McGavran. Now, we'll talk about Cameron Townsend in more detail, but Cameron Townsend founded Wycliffe Bible Translators, and Donald McGavran was very influential in what became known as the church growth movement. What's fascinating about these two men that actually Ralph Winter doesn't mention is that both of them found technological solutions to mission problems. The Christian mission was reaching out into new areas, into what we call amongst unreached peoples these days, and Cameron Townsend found a solution in the use of what was then the modern science of linguistics, and Donald McGavran found a solution in the science of sociology and statistics as a way of targeting where the Christian gospel should reach. And I think there is a real irony in that going into some of the less developed parts of the world, reaching the gospel into areas that had never gone before, the solution rested very much within the Western intellectual tradition and Western technology. Cameron Townsend was an inspirational figure. He started his young life as a coal porter, taking scriptures into Latin America, working particularly in Guatemala. And he was wandering around giving out Spanish Bibles and Spanish scriptures to people in a market town. And there were in the market there were some Indians from the Cachaquel people who lived in the highlands. And when Cameron Townsend presented a gospel to one of them, his reply was, "If your God's so clever, how come he doesn't speak my language?" And that brought it home to Townsend that Spanish Bibles just didn't cut the mustard. They didn't reach people who didn't speak Spanish. And that there were tribal peoples that the mission movement seemed to be unaware of, scattered around the world. He returned to North America and tried to interest various mission groups in reaching the tribal peoples, but there was very little interest. And so eventually Cameron Townsend founded Wycliffe Bible Translators, the organisation I belong to, with the view that there may be up to 500 tribal groups who needed the scriptures translated into their language. And one of the contributions that Wycliffe and its partner organisations have made over the years is linguistic survey, noting how many languages there are, and much rather than the 500 that Cameron Townsend thought we needed, we now know that there are getting on for 7,000 languages in the world, of which 2,500 are still in need of scripture translation. Cameron Townsend was very much a pioneer, but it's also important to realise that he was coming out of a particular historical and cultural context. The 1930s were a point where Christian missions were starting to reach into areas that were extremely different to anywhere they'd been before. The hidden groups, the unreached peoples, the minority groups around the world, very, very different to the sort of contexts that had been Christian up till then. And also this was a point in which the United States of America was becoming the main mission sending country. And the United States of America didn't have the same colonial history that the European nations had had. And mission was very much decoupled from the empire, from colonialism at this point. And this gave us the opportunity, gave the church the opportunity to start to rethink what it means to present the Christian gospel in new situations. How does the Christian gospel get transmitted across cultural and linguistic boundaries? In some senses, this can just be very, very simple. My wife and I worked as translators among a people group called the Kuya in Ivory Coast. And we discovered very early on that traditional expressions such as using the heart for the seat of emotions didn't work. The Kuya don't feel, don't love with their heart, they love with their liver. And to present the Christian message amongst the Kuya, you had to use liver where we'd have used heart. And contextualisation is finding appropriate ways, culturally and linguistically, to express the gospel. At its most simple, it's just finding new ways in language. But it can go much deeper than that. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of contextualisation comes from the book Peace Child by Don Richardson, in which he talks about working among the Sawi people of Irian Jaya or Papua in Indonesia. The Sawi prized treachery. Their heroes in their stories were people who made friends in order to kill people. So they would make friends with someone, pretend to care for them, and then kill them. And so when the gospel story was presented to them, the hero was Judas, who befriended Jesus and then betrayed him, which on balance wasn't really what was required. But Don Richardson found that in Sawi culture they had a concept called the peace child. And when relationships between two groups broke down entirely, a father would give his son to the opposing group. And if somebody gave their son, it meant that you could trust them. They were being honest, and no one would break the bond of the peace child. And Richardson used that as what he calls a redemptive analogy for the gospel, to explain how God the Father gave God the Son in order to reconcile God and man.